Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to highlight some of the differences between QSM 6.0 and its preceding versions. I will also highlight the PJLA transition requirements related to transitioning from QSM 5.4 to 6.0. Perry Johnson Lab Accreditation is an internationally recognized accreditation body in the fields of calibration, testing in medical labs, inspection bodies, reference material producers, and proficiency testing providers. PJLA is also recognized as a STEAM partner and in many state and federal accreditation programs. This webinar aims to provide information related to the changes of the standard, but it's going to be a high-level overview. For specific requirements, consult the standard directly and compare to the previous version of the standard. Because of the amount of change, this webinar is really a summary of a few of the important changes and is not an exhaustive list. I will most likely not have a lot of time to answer questions, but if you have interpretation issues, consult the EDQW or the Department of Energy directly. If you have transition questions for PJLA or how we are going about the transition, feel free to email me directly after the presentation. I'll get started with the PJLA transition policy. We're no longer accepting applications for QSM 5.4. Applicants that applied prior to June 13th of this year and accredited organizations will be able to transition to QSM 6 through a surveillance assessment, a reassessment, or have a separate extraordinary assessment just for the transition. Additional time will most likely be needed depending on the assessment type. All assessments will be required to be performed on site. And organizations must be accredited by June 30th, 2026. So all assessments must occur no later than February 28th, 2026, regardless of your routine schedule. So a couple things to be aware of. No standard is perfect. And just as quickly as a standard comes out, there's errata information that becomes available. So sources of requirements for during the assessment will come from obviously QSM 6, but there's also related supplemental information released as memos available at the EDQW website. And that link is on the slide here, www.denex.osd.mil/EDQW. It's important to check that site frequently just to make sure that any clarifications that come out you are made aware of. So we'll start with the standard. First, there is no longer a volume 1. It's one document with 8 modules and 2 appendices. Module 1 is related to proficiency testing. Modules 2 through 7 are pretty much what you're familiar with in terms of the general flow of the old document. there's a new module, Module 8, which is entirely devoted to industrial hygiene testing. There's also updates to the Appendix B QC requirements and the LCS tables. Appendices A, D, and E that were formerly in 5.4 are no longer found in the document. So we'll start with Module 1 and talk a little bit about some of the changes to proficiency testing, because they're quite profound. So there's essentially 3 avenues of participation in PT. Outside of industrial hygiene, that will have its own PT requirements in Module 8. What approach you use depends on the circumstance in the field of accreditation. So first, the field of accreditation is the matrix technology or method and analyte combination which the accreditation bodies offer accreditation. So this can be a technology-based field of accreditation associated to an analyte. The only caveat is drinking water is still by method. So the approaches have a hierarchy. First, if there's a TNI field of proficiency testing test available, that's the one that you're required to take. When there is no TNI PT available, you have the option for analytes that do not appear on the FOPT to participate from a 17043 accredited PTP that's either located in the US or Canada. Now, if there's no commercial PTs available for the test in the US or Canada, you have the option of doing one of 3 things. First, you can seek an international study from a 17043 accredited vendor. You can use a non-accredited PT provider with the appropriate approval from the accreditation body. But remember, in this case, then the PT study frequency is still going to be the same. And the final option would be determination of precision and bias for those things that there is no PT available. And again, it would follow, there's some additional criteria within the document, but this would still be done at the same frequency as maintaining records of performance and review twice per year, just as any other PT study. These utilize a minimum of 8 samples to evaluate the precision and bias. You would need to have the results available for and report them to the AB just as you would a PT. Now, there is also, just again, be aware that these options ensure that the lab maintains proficiency and meets the accreditation standards, even when there's no PT available. So there's a slight deviation from what it's been in the past, where it was primarily based on the TNI FOPT tables. Additional items to think about is, well, what happens if I have a suite of analytes? I have a large number of analytes do I need to do precision and bias for those analytes that aren't in the studies? And the answer is no. There is an out by the standard for methods that have a suite of analytes, say 8270, 8260, where you're not going to cover all the analytes of interest in the PT study. Additional analytes meet the successful analysis of the FOPT based on that study for the method itself. There is one exception to this rule, that if PTs exist for specific analytes, not in a full PT mix, you would need to participate in that PT. So similar to the past, you can analyze and report by a single method to represent a technology. And similarly, in the past, if you fail a PT study or found not acceptable, that affects all of the technology, just not that specific method. What's a little bit different is that if the laboratory reports a single method to represent that technology, and you use multiple combinations of prep or analytical methods in your normal analysis, you will need to have a documented schedule rotating the combinations used for each PT study. And every combination must be used at a minimum of 3 years for each matrix involved. So that is a large change where you will need a documented schedule to do that rotation and make sure that everything gets covered over that 3-year period. And just another reminder is if you are accredited for drinking water by this program, it's still by method, so this wouldn't apply. So there is also another set of requirements around precision and bias. If that's the route you're going, well, you need to identify to your AB a list of items where there's no commercial PT available. For DOE, the laboratory also has to submit that list in writing to all its impacted DOE customers. This standard is going more towards a lot of transparency and visibility for the end users. There is a procedure required that you'd have to create for the precision and bias. There are records already specified in the standard. And again, as I indicated in the earlier slide, if you're doing precision and bias studies twice a year, timing requirements are the same as PT studies, and additional requirements on the approach are identified in the standard. Moving on to Module 2, the quality systems general requirements, there are some paradigm shifting definition changes, and the ABs were trained that definitions are equal requirements. So we can cite definitions on the basis of a nonconformance. So that's something to be aware of. And some of the definitions you really want to review. And there's also definition clarifications in that section annually, mid-range, multi-level calibration versus a multi-point calibration. These are clearly defined. And there's an update on the quality system matrix. It's expanded upon what you're used to from the TNI practices and old approach based on the TNI standard. So the standard is no longer just about data integrity. It's a documented program to detect and deter improper, inappropriate, or prohibited practices. So there's record requirements. Records shall be maintained to demonstrate compliance with the schedule of items to be reviewed. So to just an additional requirement to think about as you're going through module 2. It's another one of those changes. Where the standard itself, the DoD side really has aligned more with ISO terminology and flexibility related to technical director and things and quality manager. DOE, if your DOE lab, has kept the named roles with clarified duties for technical manager and quality manager. Just a subtle difference that you need to be aware of. Another item to be aware of is there's a requirement that actually came out of the supplemental information version 2 memo from the EDQW in March. Personnel dealing with radioactive samples need training in radioactive sample receipt, waste management, material shipping and handling. The clarification in that memo says that this is not a DOE only requirement. If you are testing radioactives and radioactive samples are being sent for radiological testing, these requirements now apply. So I think we've always been on a pretty standard interpretation on the use of certified reference materials. The standard now requires the use of certified reference materials for calibration standards from either a 17034 accredited reference material producer, or you can use SRMs from NIST. And one thing to be aware of, the standard now allows that when you're using CRMs from an accredited provider, and this isn't reference materials without a stated uncertainty, this is a true certified reference material, you don't need to do a second source calibration verification. It's only in the cases that you are using reference material or a reference standard that is not accredited source that you would still need to do that second source verification. That's a large change to this standard. Waivers, one of the big changes when it comes to waivers, records of approval for waiver shall be maintained by the lab. That's the old requirement. The new part of the requirement is and included in all affected data packages. Again, transparency and visibility. You just can't tell your assessor, oh, we have a waiver for this. When we ask for data packages up front for review, we would see the waiver. And this again is more for the customer and the end use. But it should take out the waiver discussion that we've all probably gone down those avenues once or twice. Some of the changes to reporting requirements. So LOQ and the associated precision and bias at the LOQ where the determination of precision and bias at the LOQ is required. That needs to be in your quote unquote report. Before and after chromatographs of analytes for which manual integration has occurred, including the justification for the change. That now needs to be in the report. And then if you select the infrequent method option from Module 4, your LOD, LOQ verification data must be included in the report. Again, large shift on visibility, and it, just something to be aware of, because in my experience assessing, one of the challenging spots has always been keeping up with LOD, LOQ verification. So on this infrequent method option, which we'll talk about in a bit, you need to do it before the samples, and that data gets sent with those samples. So a little bit different approach. And another big change is that there is now a DOE only requirement section of Section 9, which has to do with hazardous and radioactive materials management, health and safety practices. And there's requirements around a radioactive materials management plan, waste management plan, chemical hygiene plan, sample receiving and control, records and training related to Section 9. The old appendix that had a lot of that type of information has gone away. So minimal updates on the asbestos module. Auto updates in the chemical testing module. Modified and non-reference methods require customer approval before use. Subtle change with that before use, but the language has changed, and depending on how you operate, that might be something of significance. Another thing to change, to be aware of, is when a modification includes changes to sample prep, validation of that change shall include the analysis of field samples in the matrices of concern. And you want field samples to represent the range of characteristics encountered or expected in the real field samples that you would be expecting. Some of the characteristics to consider are organic matter content, clay, moisture, pH, dissolved and suspended solids. All of that can create problems within the matrix, and you want to be able to validate the actual approach that you're doing for the customer is appropriate for their intended use and the extraction for those samples. And the last requirement about that is validation shall include parallel studies to compare performance of a reference method to the modified method where possible. Still on the topic of validation, field sample shall contain target analytes, either found in the samples or spiked into the sample. Validation shall include, this is another significant change, validation shall include multiple levels of target analyte concentrations, so not a one and done. Where the method includes more than 45 target analytes, a representative subset of at least 45 analytes are to be used. And then if you know that there's a subset that shows the most bias for the reference method, You need to use that for the validation. Can't cherry pick and use the best performers. You have to use the worst performers in that study. And where modifications are only to the analytical portion, it's pretty much the same old, same old. Take into account any matrix effects impacting analysis as part of your risk assessment of that validation. Calibrations, new set of requirements, which also appears in the B tables. For calibrations evaluated using correlation coefficient or coefficient of determination, you need to either calculate the relative error or relative standard error. When you're using a method blank, samples are considered contaminated if the target is in the blank exceeds half the LOQ or 1/10 of the amount measured in any associated sample, whichever is greater. This also is in those Appendix B tables. For your positive control, there is a hierarchy in a lot of the tables related to the acceptance criteria, use of customer provided accepted criteria. If customer provided acceptance criteria is not available, you default to the Appendix C limits. And if the Appendix C limits are not available, you're to use your laboratory developed acceptance criteria. So that affects a lot of the technologies, will probably impact every SOP between the method blank, the positive control. There's similar changes for continuing calibration to be aware of that about around limits. So in the past, for detection limit, we were able to pick really what we wanted to do for the DL. In the previous QSM, one example of the MDL approach was the EPA MDL process. If you've done that, you don't have to change your MDL or your DL. If you haven't and you had another approach, the procedure will now need to be compliant with the EPA MDL revision 2 and meet the criteria. And just to point out, you do not need to do DL or LOD determinations if you're not reporting data below the LOQ. But there's a caveat, unless required by regulation or method. So pay attention to what your method references are, because if you're using a lot of the straight EPA methods, not SW846, but the EPA methods themselves, many of them have embedded MDL requirements in the method itself. Metals, organics methods. So, that's something to be aware of when you're considering. Changes to LOD. This is quite different. You initially determine your LOD. You would still have ongoing verifications quarterly. And then you would have to update when the method is either altered, and that they're defining that as other than routine maintenance. If you take the approach of verification per batch basis for infrequently used methods, whichever verification frequency is chosen, you live with that for 12 months. So you can't pick and choose if you get a contract and the floodgates open and you said you're going to verify per batch. Until 12 months is up, you're going to verify per batch. There's not an alternative. Procedurally, things have changed. Initially, the spike will set the LOD. Ongoing spikes need to be somewhere at less than or equal to half the LOD, or greater than, the spike needs to be between half the LOD and 2 times the LOD. The signal to noise ratio is now greater than or equal to 3. Or you can do the signal is greater than the MDLB from the EPA document. So change to LOD. So this means you're setting that initially, the spike sets the LOD. So if new LODs are needed for basically any chemical test, which then triggers the new LOQ. And sorry about the font so small, but I wanted to parallel both sets of requirements. Again, significant change. The requirements are still the same around verifications quarterly or a per batch basis, but again, it specifies, minimum of 12 months. If the method is modified, precision and bias at the new LOQ needs to be demonstrated. To establish your LOQ, you utilize the LOD or half the LOQ less than or equal to the LOQ, spike, and then greater than 2 times or equal to the LOQ. So you have that range, which is different than there was really no defined range. So this probably impacts how you demonstrate your LOQ. You need to be able to demonstrate precision and bias. That isn't really a new requirement. When you use multiple instruments reporting the same LOQ, the spikes need to be distributed between the instruments. Can't use your best instrument to report your lab LOQ, and you have instruments that don't meet that. It needs to be pooled. Criteria in the past was, precision and bias meet client requirements. Now there's a whole trigger of requirements related to that. So again, larger change to really look at and apply. You will need to have, for any interested party, DL, LOD, LOQ summary information available. Evaluation of precision and bias is also required now. A procedure is required for that, and it needs to be evaluated across the analytical calibration range of the method. So you need to understand your precision and bias, low end, medium, and high end of the method, covering your calibration range. Every data package will include, again, that precision and bias at the LOQ, and then the LOD, LOQ verification data for the infrequent method option. Another change that you need to be aware of, the previous QSM allowed for 2 passing CCVs to negate 1 failing CCV. That is no longer an option. If you know the cause of a CC failure and can identify it and that it really is related just to the CCV, misinjection, analysis can proceed if a second CCV is analyzed. But there's a caveat. It's within 1 hour and there's no samples analyzed. If you had a misinject and started running samples again without a confirmation, you have to do a complete rerun. And the result of that second CCV must be within the acceptance criteria. So again, just something else to be aware of, subtle change, but I'm pointing out things that will potentially make you think for the laboratories that are accredited both under the TNI standard and going towards the QSM, because it's becoming 2 distinct sets of requirements. That harmonization is really starting to go away to the point that it's going to, add significant work on an assessment and probably add time. So for the last one for chemical testing, and this I've already covered. So this is about the modification. So we'll move on. I don't know how that slide got out of order. Minimal updates for microbiology. Module 6, there is a supplemental information memo from the EDQW. This has a lot of criteria clarifications that, essentially this is an errata sheet in that case, fixing some of the errors that were in the original QSM. So again, here's the DENX website. Go to the EDQW site and be sure to get a copy of that memo to have it on hand if that affects you. So toxicity, minimal updates, industrial hygiene. So this one, if you're doing IH methods, NIOSH methods, those types of methods for air sampling and dusts and wipes, that's going to now apply. The old standard used to just lump it in with chemistry, and the 2 paradigms really, didn't work. So the industrial hygiene chapter now, there's PT requirements. You can do your external PT. You can do a round robin with AB notification. If you're not participating in a round robin and there's no external, again with AB notification, you can develop an internal procedure, an internal round robin. If there's no internal PT program, you need AB concurrence to meet PT by your ongoing QC. And there would be, you also have a procedural requirement around that. So if you do IH work, this will actually align more with how you do all your other work. But it's a paradigm shift from the old approach. Also note that there are now going to be Appendix B tables for industrial hygiene technologies. So something else to be aware of. And really, like I said, this really aligns more with an industrial hygiene approach. This is closer to the AIHA application of the concept of industrial hygiene testing. So if you're part of that community and do a lot of testing for IH, this will actually make things a little easier than in the past. So Appendix B is, I would encourage you to read the relevant tables very carefully. Quality controls are required unless listed as optional. Calibration options are shown unless they're not allowed. We already discussed the evaluation of relative error. And like I said, there's updated method blank criteria. There's updated LCS criteria, which impacts most methods. Like I said, the approach I would take here is read your SOP, read the table, and update accordingly. And then, work backwards from there. But I think this is a significant lift, as well as the LOD, LOQs. Also, for the LCS limits, so Appendix C has now LCS limits. I want to just point out that, again, remember from some of the QC tables for Appendix B, the LCS limits, that flow is customer specified, Appendix C limits, then lab development limits, not in Appendix C. So again, I want to just stress that, think about that, and be aware. Also, statement about surrogates. Lab shall evaluate surrogate spike recoveries using acceptance criteria provided by the customer, or if customer requirements not provided, using appropriate Appendix C limits. So another notice. So, this was difficult to put this presentation together because I'm trying to summarize, a minimum of 5 hours of training, a maximum of 8 hours of training. And I didn't go into depth in any specific topic. And though I had so many slides that I cut, in preparation for this, we will have some time for questions. But before that, I just want to say that in summary, the standard has really shifted its focus from being that prescriptive document that we're all used to being really risk-based driving. And the intent here is to drive more consistent data comparability with transparency for the end users of the data. With some of the fundamental changes starting from the definitions and ending in the Appendix B tables, this standard kind of sets itself apart from the preceding standards, where there was nominal change and update. This is a paradigm shift. And it might be easier to think of this as a new standard that you're preparing for rather than a subtle transition. So, and the implementation is going to create challenges. It's, you know, SOPs need to be reviewed and updated against the tables. LOD, LOQs need to be started. But there's also going to be challenges from the assessment perspective. We're going to need a lot more data to review. And if it starts with a contract, because, oh, well, our contract says this, we're going to need to go back to those contracts and dig in to verify that. So be patient, especially the first couple of years. We're all getting familiar with this together. So it's important to, you know, be candid. And if you have questions, again, really, I encourage you to get in touch with DoD, the EDQW, or DOE and or DOE, depending on the nature of the question. Another word to really, you know, think about is these assessments are going to take more time. There's going to be a lot more data up front. And really, the goal here is to drive the DoD, DOE efforts for them to have better data to make better informed decisions. That's what this program has always been for. And this shift really goes to that next level. So since we have a few minutes, we can open this up if you have questions. Let's see. Will we be receiving a copy of the presentation? Yes, I can make that available. Feel free to send me an email directly, msica@pjlabs. I'll actually move the slide over. Here's my email address, and I will gladly get you that. So what if the CCV failed during an overnight run and you discover it after 1 hour? The standard is really clear. You have 1 hour. Your clock is running. You can always. These are the types of things that you would need to really get a standards interpretation from the EDQW. But as the standard reads currently, you'd have to set the run up again. The next question is, for ongoing DOC, at least 4 consecutive lab control with acceptable. I'm not sure where the question is in that. So, okay, here's the follow-up. What does the consecutive refer to? I interpret it as 4 aliquots taken without a date break. So back to the requirement, LCS, 4 consecutive lab control samples. So it would be 4 in a row that analyst has performed. So if they only, let's say you rotate your staff, because we've all learned lessons from COVID. So people are now staying current on various methods. I would say, you know, I would interpret that as whatever basis the next 4 that person ran. And we have, and when I have Alyssa here, I'm gonna try to, need to find you first, Alyssa, bear with me. Okay, Alyssa, you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Matt, for doing that. I feel like we can never have enough training on this new manual. You hit a few key points, and number one, it is a different manual. It is not an upgrade. It is a whole new manual that you need to comply with the requirements. And when we wrote this manual, we wrote it to be a requirement manual. We took out guidance. We took out anything that was a note. So it hopefully reads really clearly to you. The other point that Matt made is that these assessments are going to take more time. It's just going to be the way it's going to be. I know that's an extra burden on assessors. I know that's an extra burden on laboratories as far as financial resources, but that is the way it's going to be. We have given laboratories an implementation cycle in which to follow for both the DoD and the DOE. Those assessments can start now. Laboratories must be assessed to the version no later than June 30th of 2020. Oh, now I'm going to get myself 26, I guess. I think it's 26. Anyway, so the other thing I wanted to know, DOE, although we attend the Department of Defense's EDQW meetings, we are not EDQW. So if it's DOE specific, that needs to come to either myself or Steve Clark. And lastly, obviously both agencies take these assessments very seriously. As far as the DOE side, I plan on being on as many of these 6.0 assessments, the first ones as I can. I hope the assessors take it seriously. If you find a finding, if it is a finding and it should be written as a finding, not something that we can haphazardly say, oh, they identified it, they're going to correct it. We need to take these things seriously and treat it like an assessment. The accrediting bodies you guys work for are ILAC signatories, and they have certain requirements they have to follow to remain an ILAC signatory. So just wanted to give you a little bit of background, a little additional information. It's going to be a slow start, and we're going to, have our oversight out there, and we're certainly here if you guys have questions, and we will try to respond as quickly as possible. But thanks, Matt, for the webinar. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the words. So, anyone else have any additional questions? So, again, this was really a high-level overview. This is, I'm trying to identify a day's worth of training easily in a very short time. And the challenge I had was every time I went back to the manual, I saw something in a different light. And the only thing I can say is read, and reread the standard as you're implementing. It's all about continuous improvement, and data transparency is the more I read the standard, that's how I see it. So, there's always going to be nonconformances, especially this is, like I said, it's a new beast, and really a new standard in terms of thinking about it. Just because it's a QSM, it's not the old QSM that was pretty much similar from 4.1 to 5.4 with subtle changes as T&I changes and adaptations of standards, and subtle, updates. This is a paradigm shift. So again, patience, read the standard, ask the accreditation bodies questions, ask the EDQW and DOE questions if you have technical questions. The standard is much clearer, but it takes several reads because we're so used to that T&I mentality. And this really is differentiating itself from that approach to a large degree. Conceptually it's the same, but there's a lot more to it now, and there's a lot more data-driven substance that we need to all be aware of. So with that, and seeing no further questions, thank you for your time. And I look forward to seeing you at another webinar. Thank you.